Hello everyone, this is Natalie Nugents and this is the webinar on training needs analysis. Thank you for joining me today. Now, in my work with clients, I often get asked if the training an organization uses is the right mix. There's often pushback if there's perceived to be too much training by staff. And of course, there's always that looming threat of court action if you're missing topics. So that's the topic of today's program. We do want to hear from you. You can ask any questions in the Q&A box. And if there's time at the end, I will take some questions. Otherwise, I will respond to those separately afterwards. You can find GRC Solutions on Twitter and Facebook. And of course, you can contact us via the website. Now, I've worked in learning development for many years. I currently work as a learning consultant for a training provider that mainly focuses on mandatory compliance learning. It's really a privileged position because I work closely with my clients. I get insights into their organizations. I get to see some of the problems they face and help them develop creative solutions for their staff in Australia and around the world. So today I'm going to take you through the basics of conducting a training needs analysis and outline the current training environment in most organizations. I'll give you tips and tricks on how to identify challenges and opportunities in the organization, how to recommend and socialize a revised approach, and how to provide a final guide to an organization-wide structured compliance training framework. But let's start at the beginning. Training needs analysis is a comprehensive assessment of an organization's training requirements. It will take several days to complete, and the output is a comprehensive report that covers all the aspects of development and implementation. Compliance training is rarely aligned with job functions and potential risk. Now, this is really odd because when you think about it, the more targeted the training is, the less you waste in terms of people's time, lost productivity, and also the organization's investment. So a training needs analysis helps you identify performance gaps and determine which training can successfully address those deficits. The training needs analysis is performed to see if a learning or training solution will solve a particular business problem. So at a very basic level, it comes down to looking at the following three questions. Where are we now? Where do we need to be? And how do we get there? So where do you start? Before you can get into the nitty-gritty of the actual analysis, there's a list of questions, practical questions, you need to address first. These are the 10 basic questions I always start with. Number one, excuse me, what is the perceived problem? Now, this is the crux of any training needs analysis, and it's not always known. I will talk about this in more detail a bit later on, but let's just continue looking at the basics first. Secondly, what is the aim and the objective of the organization? So, are we ticking compliance boxes? Are we looking for a change in employee behavior, etc.? Next question, what is expected from the training needs analysis process? What is your focus? Do you look at mandatory training only, or do you include all topics, including onboarding, all career planning topics? What about policies and procedures? I have to say, if you've never done this before, I'd really recommend looking at one area only. What performance is required from the employees? Now, if you know what problem you're facing, you can be really descriptive here. I'll give you a basic example a bit next. But if you don't, then have a think of the culture in your organization and work out how easy it will be to achieve a change in behavior. If you have a compliant workforce, people will just get on board. But there will be more resistance if training is linked to people's yearly KPIs or if the workforce sees training as a burden. So considering the end user in everything you do is always the key to success. And also, depending on your culture, you may need to overcome some hurdles. Next one, time frame to implementation. Now, the answer to this is always yesterday, of course. But depending on the scale of your analysis, the more realistic answer will be a few months away, especially if it includes sourcing and rolling out new training or creating a new policy or procedure. One thing a lot of people don't think about is the budget as well. So there's the investment of your time, as well as of all your colleagues who will contribute to the process. But the deeper you get into this, you will often see that you need new training. You will need a different mode of delivery or a better platform. So assess all of this before you go in, so you really know what your limitations are. Who are the stakeholders? And by that, I mean, who are your sponsors, or who are those who support you with this project? And what information do they need? What do they want from the training needs analysis? Everyone will always want to see the actual training needs analysis or the final guide. But depending on your approach, you may need a cost analysis as well, or some other additional information. So always check that first as well. Who will implement the solutions? Here you will need buy-in from, for example, L&D to create new training, or the LMS administrator, so you can streamline what training is allocated to which employee. Now, if you don't have buy-in because they are simply too busy or don't have time for you, go and look for alternatives, because otherwise you will not be able to action your final report. Very important. This one I also love. What barriers exist? What's out of bounds? For example, the business may have just implemented a new system after months of planning. So nobody will want you to say, I think we need a new HR management system. There are always sensitivities in any organization. There may have been an embarrassing breach or trouble with a certain team or department. So ask for honest feedback. Ask where the business really does not want you to go. And finally, eat, sleep, train, repeat. In other words, when will you do this again? Doing one training needs analysis in isolation is good, but it's not very helpful in the long run. Why? Because next year you will need to include your evaluation. So in all your preparations, make sure you think of the training needs analysis of next year. The situation this year is X, but next year I'd like us to sit at Y. Okay, this is probably the most tedious slide out of the whole deck, with a lot of arrows and very PowerPointy, but I'll talk you through it. This actually puts the whole process neatly into order. So starting at the top left, you'll start with the question, what's the organization's problem? And again, more about that in a moment. Secondly, what must the learner be able to do? Next step, what new knowledge and skills do they need? And finally, what's the best training vehicle or mode of delivery? Then you move sideways into the evaluation phase. So that's not something you do initially, but after a few months or even further later down the year. That's where you look at the motivation. So is staff motivated to learn and perform? And how about the learning? Did they learn the needed skills? The performance, did they transfer their skills to the workplace? And of course, the million-dollar question, the result. Is the desired impact being felt? See, a lot less words on this slide. Define the problem. I have mentioned that not every organization knows what problem they're facing, but some do. If you have a clear driver or an area of risk that needs addressing, then you can organize a very targeted approach. Let me give you a very basic example. Take data security. Pretty much every organization has protecting the integrity of IT systems in their risk top 5. Most organizations have also encountered malware that enabled outsiders to enter their systems and access their data. This was most likely to have happened because an employee clicked on an infected email. And there's your objective right there. Where are we now? So this is translating it to our 3 basic questions again. Where are we now? We're fighting fires with malware infecting our systems. Where do we need to be? We need to get to a situation where employees don't open links in phishing emails. How do we get there? We need to identify those most at risk and teach them how to distinguish fake from real emails. This is a very basic assessment for only one small risk area, but asking yourself these basic 3 questions really helps guide your thinking. From my experience in the early phase, it's always better to approach things from a higher and perhaps a more simplistic level before you start filling in the details. Because really the last thing you want is to feel like you're doing a 2,000-piece jigsaw puzzle that has a picture of an ocean and the sky. However, what I see most commonly in my work with clients is that the training needs analysis is used as a fact-finding mission. The business is not confident that every employee has an accurate training profile. They just don't know if they're allocated too much training or if every risk aspect in the business is covered. Many organizations simply don't know if they are exposed and if the employees or the business itself is at risk. And that's totally understandable because there's 2 sides to this coin. Every organization duly trains its staff in a range of topics that was deemed necessary at some stage in the past. Employees do this training every year without further consideration whether they still need it or whether they need to do all of it. The other side of the coin is the law. Most organizations react to a legislative change. New legislation comes in with hefty fines attached. So it's often things are flying under the radar, but now all of a sudden there's this new legislation coming in and there's an obligation to train employees. What does an organization do? They go, quick, let's get some training in place. So if you look at it from that perspective, it's really easy to see why training profiles become muddled. Now, I do have to say that things are a lot more interesting if you don't know what you don't know. If you start with an open slate, you start with these questions. And this is your groundwork, very important. How much thought is given to the existing training solutions? Is it driven by the organization's needs? Or is it driven by perceived threat of legal action? If you notice that all employees are assigned training with little regard as to whether it's relevant to their jobs, you're very likely to encounter a workforce that sees training as a burden. If you work in an industry that receives a lot of negative publicity, you're going to encounter a workforce that's just not proud of their work. I think this is called the barbecue test. It's where a stranger asks you, so what do you do at a friend's barbecue? I think any bank employee will recognize this feeling when they think of the Royal Commission last year. So it's really important you do the groundwork so you can go in with your eyes open. So some of these considerations tie back to what I mentioned earlier about training focus being led by legal ramifications or even good corporate citizenship, but it's important to get the whole picture. In reality, we see that training focus isn't necessarily driven by internal factors. So the thing that gets every organization running is a run-in with the regulator or the courts. Now, unsurprisingly, most training programs are installed because of a fear of legal ramifications. Anti-money laundering is a huge concern at the moment. I think we talk about it, well, not all day, every day, but it comes close. But you need to remember that these focuses are changing all the time. A few years ago, we were talking about bullying and harassment all the time, and particularly in relation to social media. Training focus can also be driven by outside influences, such as brand damage or even public pressure. Last year's Royal Commission, again, is a great example of a driver of change within the banks. So a large breach that is played out in the media usually sends many unrelated organizations into a spin too. But it's not always the carrot and stick approach that dominates training focus. It's also often driven by a strategic focus of the business. One of my clients, who employs thousands of people across Australia, they wanted to ensure that their workplace is a safe place for women who experience domestic violence. Now, this is not a measure driven by legislation, but very much the corporate identity where the organization felt a responsibility to protect vulnerable women in their workplace. They ended up teaming up with White Ribbon to analyze and accredit the workplace, and they implemented an awareness strategy and a training program. It's a really wonderful initiative. Now, anyone aware with AML will probably know and notice that KYC has been changed a little bit here from know your client to know your colleagues. Because now is really the time to create a list of questions and get to know your colleagues and their jobs really well. I think this is the best part. For some organizations conduct a fact-finding survey, but the most valuable exercise is conducting interviews with key departments, especially senior representatives of HR, learning development, governance, risk and compliance, an internal audit representative, maybe accounts, IT, legal. Then you select some mid-level and senior team managers who work in operational teams, because they'll be able to tell you how everything works in practice. And also, don't forget your average everyday user. Ask lots of them and ask lots of questions. What is the problem? What are the problems? What can we do better? How can we make your life easier? You'll be surprised by how much information you get. Do make sure, though, that you don't set an expectation that every concern will be acted upon. What you're doing initially in these fact-finding interviews is you're looking for glaring alarm bells or trends across the business. So in this exercise, it's important to also expect negative feedback and let colleagues be honest in their assessments. This gives you the chance to zoom in on pain points and assess where solutions are needed. I'd actually go as far as saying that the training needs analysis process is probably worthless if you don't get any negative feedback. The feedback sessions may take a few days, depending on what you're trying to achieve, but the outcomes of this are the most valuable. It also uncovers exposed areas that the organization may not have considered before. For example, during a fact-finding interview I did earlier this year, an employee observed that their office wasn't secure. Any member of the public could simply step into the lift, travel up to any floor, and enter the premises. Now, this comment was completely unrelated to the interview topic, which was around bullying and harassment. But this came out, and we obviously had to escalate the issue to the highest level within the organization so that security measures could be put in place. So along with the interviews, you need to find the following data. Are there any recent legal actions against the organization or the department? What about regulatory training requirements? What about industry trends and changes, regulatory updates? Again, public pressure. And in an ideal world, last year's training needs analysis. Okay. A key component to recording and analysing data is to document all of your discussions. In fact, documentation is crucial to every step in the process. So think of it as an audit trail that you can always look at for reference. If you're examined or audited, this information will need to be easily accessible, and it should therefore be included in the appendix of your final report. So at a minimum, your documentation should include a name, title, department, and the role of those who were interviewed, then the date, time, place of meeting, your discussion points, your action items and next steps, if that's required. When you're analysing the data, you need to be organised. So ideally, you use a program like Excel or a project management tool, so you can easily search, filter, or sort the data. It's also important that you place the data into a specific format, because this will allow you to review the data to see the consistencies, the trends, and the themes. Once your format is set, it's time to start inputting the data. So for every entry, you want to be as descriptive as possible. The example you see on screen is an example that Justin Mascolino, is my colleague in the US, created earlier this year. Again, it's really simple, it's very effective. So we're looking, what's the source? Where was the issue initially identified? Which business areas are affected? What's the topic? Then you provide a brief description of the problem. Write down any thoughts you have before the meeting, and you finish off with any additional comments and action points post-meeting. Now, once you've done all this, you're ready to start compiling the training plan. So when you're putting together the final plan, remember also to focus on your existing workforce, but also on new hires, consultants, contractors, third parties, as well as the mode of delivery. We will send you a link with the recording of this webinar where you can access a sample training plan, but the basic categories in your training plan are pretty much listed here. So your training details, and in a minimum, should include your course title, code, module title, description of the content. Is it currently in use across the organization? Yes or no? Should it be in use? What do you think? What's your advice? Then you start looking at the target audience. So the department that needs the training, or the certain groups that need the training. What about your new and existing employees? Do they need this training? Again, what about your contractors and the other outsiders? Training approach. What's your method of delivery? Who's your content provider? What's the primary motivation? Effectiveness of measurement? And then you start looking at the logistics, where you look at frequency and duration. And then, of course, the gold nuggets are always to be found in the comments section. The last categories in the training plan talk about training development and the mode of delivery. Now, I don't have the time today to go into too much detail about this, but I do want to share the 4 main pillars of good training plans and development, because I think that no matter what you do, those 4 are really crucial in whatever solution you find for your organization. So the first one, I've already mentioned it, is relevance. is it relevant? With everything you do, ask yourself, does this person need to know this? Focus on your audience. Do you have a one-size-fits-all, or do you have role-specific? So role-specific means creating relevant training. Making content interesting deals with employee backlash. A few years ago, I found a quote on a forum, and I've used it many times, but it just captures the essence of training that's not allocated correctly. And it goes something like, they're making me do this really boring training at work, and in case I ever need to spot money laundering, and it's possibly the most boring training ever, and it doesn't apply to me at all. Please distract me, is how they end. Now, we know that anti-money laundering is very relevant. It was a few years ago, it still is today. But the training this employee was doing just didn't pull out the relevant parts. So make it relevant. Make sure that when somebody sees the training, that they go, oh yeah, I get that. I see how this relates to me and my job. Second pillar is simple. Now, don't confuse this with easy, because it's the hardest bit. It's harder than creating a 4-hour course, because you need good research, good writing, great storytelling, and really good design. Simple is really challenging, because you can never underestimate your people's intelligence, and you need to distill the training so that the key messages stand out. Very tricky. Practical and timely. With practical, I mean the takeaway points, and that's a bit like the action items after a meeting. Timely is what's happening in the organization. So you look at the news, what's happening around us right now? What can we use in our learning? On the front page of the ABC News website this morning was a headline, more than 300 visa applicants had personal data sent to an unknown email address. Now, that's the perfect introduction to explaining privacy and the importance of safeguarding personal information. Then the last pillar is cognitive ease. Cognitive ease makes us feel more favorable towards things that are familiar, easy to understand, and easy to see and read. So it's a feel-good response that comes from the unconscious part of our brain. So when you're creating material, use familiarity in design. So you use corporate colors, design, tone of voice, but also familiar faces and colleagues sharing their stories. Now, we did a webinar about this topic about a year ago. It was called Training That Sticks, and it's available on our YouTube channel. It also includes the section on the 4 pillars. When we share the notes of this webinar, I'll make sure this link will be included with the webinar notes. Okay, this is all we have time for today. I'm quickly going to see if there's any questions in our Q&A inbox. I can't see anything there. So that's the end then for the webinar for today. Please get in touch via our website or via my contact details on screen. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.